The stars had never felt so cold to Admiral Park Do-yen as they did that night. He stood alone on the observation deck of his flagship, the Indomitable, watching the distant glow of Kepler Station. 3 weeks ago, that station had been home to 3 million humans. Now it was nothing but twisted metal and frozen bodies floating in the darkness of space. The Vreth swarm had come without warning, as they always did. Millions of insect-like creatures pouring out of dark space, hungry for flesh and resources. The Galactic Council had sent out the emergency call, and as always, it was the human fleets that answered first. Park remembered giving the order to hold the line. He remembered watching ship after ship fall to the swarm while Council evacuation vessels carried away. Tellurian nobles and Palaxian merchants. Not a single human civilian was allowed on those ships. The Council had decided that their priority citizens came first, and humans were not on that list. 18 days. His people had held for 18 days, buying time for species that considered them barely more than useful animals. When the battle finally ended and the swarm retreated, Park had requested permission to search for survivors among the human population. The Council had denied his request. They said the resources were needed elsewhere. Captain Yoon Haina found him still standing there, hours later. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a scar running down her left cheek, a gift from her first battle against pirates in the Outer Rim. She had grown up on a mining colony called Dustfall, where her parents had worked 12-hour shifts extracting precious metals for the Palaxian Empire. They had died when she was 16, their bodies worn out from years of labor in conditions that would have been illegal for any other species. She did not speak at first. She simply stood beside her admiral and watched the stars with him. They had served together for 15 years. She knew when words were needed, and when silence was the only comfort available. Finally, Park spoke. His voice was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The Council sent their acknowledgement today, he said. 3 million dead, and they sent us a formal note. 2 paragraphs. They thanked us for our service and reminded us that our patrol schedule remains unchanged. Hannah felt something twist in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She had learned long ago that showing anger to the Council only made things worse. Humans who complained were labeled as ungrateful. Humans who protested were reassigned to the most dangerous posts. Humans who fought back simply disappeared. "What did you expect?" she asked, not with cruelty, but with the weariness of someone who had stopped expecting anything long ago. Park turned to look at her. "I expected nothing. That is the problem. We have served them for 300 years, Hannah. We have bled for them. We have died for them. And I have reached the point where I expect nothing in return because I know they will never give us anything." That was how long it had been since humanity first reached the stars and discovered they were not alone. The Galactic Council had existed for thousands of years before humans arrived, a collection of 12 elder species who had divided the galaxy among themselves. When human explorers made first contact, the Council had looked upon them with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Humans came from Earth, a planet the Council classified as a death world. Gravity was too strong, the weather too violent, the predators too numerous. The fact that humans had survived it all was seen as evidence of their primitive nature. Civilized species evolved on gentle worlds with stable climates. Only animals came from places like Earth. But the Council quickly discovered that these animals had their uses. Humans were strong for their size, able to work in conditions that would kill more delicate species. They were adaptable, able to survive on worlds that others could not colonize. And most importantly, they were willing to fight. The elder species had grown comfortable over the millennia. They had forgotten how to make war, how to struggle, how to sacrifice. When threats emerged from the dark spaces between stars, they needed someone to stand on the front lines. Humans filled that role perfectly. In exchange for their service, humanity was given the scraps. They were allowed to colonize worlds that no one else wanted, moons and asteroids and planets with harsh environments. They were permitted to trade, but only through Council-approved channels that took most of the profit. They were given seats on minor committees, but never allowed to vote on anything that mattered. And through it all, humanity endured. They told themselves that patience would be rewarded, that if they proved their worth, the council would eventually accept them as equals. Generation after generation held on to that hope, even as the evidence mounted that it would never come true. Dr. Kong Jisu was one of the few humans allowed to work directly with the council. As humanity's official representative, she spent her days in the Great Chamber on Council Station, listening to debates about policies that would affect billions of human lives. Her seat was in the back corner, far from the speaking platform, and she was rarely given the chance to address the assembly. Today, she sat in that corner and listened as the Archon of the Tellurian hegemony discussed the battle at Kepler Station. The Archon was a tall, thin creature with silver skin and eyes that held no warmth. He spoke about human casualties, the way one might discuss broken equipment. The losses were regrettable, but acceptable, the Archon said. The human forces performed adequately, and we should acknowledge their contribution. Perhaps a small increase in their food rations would be appropriate. Jisoo felt her hands tighten on the arms of her chair. 3 million dead? He was talking about food rations like they were pets who deserved a treat for good behavior. Another council member, a Palaxian lord with scales the color of dried blood, raised his voice in agreement. Indeed, we should be grateful that we have such willing servants. The humans understand their place in the galaxy, and they fulfill their role without complaint. This is admirable. Jisoo wanted to stand up. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them that those 3 million people had names and families and dreams. She wanted to ask them how they would feel if it was their children dying in the darkness while others escaped to safety. But she said nothing. She had learned that silence was the only dignity humans were allowed in this chamber. Any protest would be dismissed as emotional outburst, proof that humans were too primitive to participate in civilized discourse. So she sat in her corner and watched and waited. Not knowing that the breaking point was closer than anyone imagined, New Busan was not a beautiful world. It was a moon orbiting a gas giant, with thin air and long winters and soil that fought against every seed planted in it. The Palaxian Empire had surveyed it 2 centuries ago and declared it worthless, not even worth the effort of claiming. So the humans took it. 40 million people now called New Busan home. They had built cities in the valleys and farms on the hillsides. They had constructed atmosphere processors that made the air breathable and heating systems that kept the cold at bay. Generation after generation had worked to turn this rejected moon into something worth living. Governor Choi Yoonji had been born on New Busan. Her grandmother had been among the first settlers, a woman who had left Earth with nothing but hope and determination. Yoonji had grown up hearing stories about those early days, when every meal was uncertain and every winter might be the last. She had watched her people struggle and sacrifice and slowly build a home from nothing. Now she stood in her office, holding a document that made her hands shake with rage. The territorial reclamation order had arrived at dawn, delivered by a Palaxian courier who had not even bothered to look her in the eye. The message was simple and brutal. Surveys had discovered rare minerals beneath New Bison's surface, minerals that the Palaxian Empire now wanted. Under an ancient treaty signed before humanity had even achieved spaceflight, the Empire had the right to reclaim any territory they had previously surveyed. 40 million people had 90 days to leave. Those who remained after that deadline would be considered trespassers and dealt with. Accordingly, .eung read the order 3 times, hoping she had misunderstood. But the words did not change. 200 years of work, 200 years of sacrifice, 200 years of building something from nothing. And it could all be erased by a single piece of paper. She called an emergency meeting of her cabinet. But there was little they could do. The council had already approved the reclamation. Every legal challenge had been rejected before it could even be filed. The Palaxians had followed the proper procedures, and in the eyes of galactic law, their claim was valid. What? Where are we supposed to go? Asked Minister of Agriculture Shin Junho, a weathered man who had spent his life coaxing crops from reluctant soil. There are no other worlds available for us. The council controls all the habitable planets, and they will not give us another one. No one had an answer. The truth was obvious to everyone in the room. The council did not care where the humans went. They simply wanted them gone. On the Indomitable, Admiral Park received the news through official channels. The message was brief and clinical, informing him that the reclamation had been approved, and that he should prepare his fleet to assist with the evacuation if requested. Captain Yoon Hana watched his face as he read. She had never seen him cry before, but she saw tears forming in his eyes now. New Busan was not his homeworld, but it was a symbol of everything humanity had built in this galaxy. It represented hope, the belief that hard work and patience would eventually be rewarded. That hope was dying. They are not even pretending anymore, Park said quietly. They are not even bothering to justify it. They simply take because they can, because they know we will not stop them. Hannah felt something shift inside her. For years, she had told herself that endurance was strength, that patience was wisdom. She had believed that if humans just kept serving and sacrificing, eventually the Council would see their worth. But standing here now, watching her admiral weep for a colony that was about to be erased, she realized the truth. The Council would never see them as equals. They would never stop taking. The only thing that would change their behavior was if humans made them stop. On Earth, United Terran Assembly convened an emergency session. Representatives from every human world gathered in the Great Hall in Geneva, their faces showing the same mixture of grief and anger that Eunjian Park and Hannah felt. Prime Minister Bae Sun-woo walked to the podium slowly. He was an old man now, with white hair and a limp he had earned fighting the Vreth in his youth. He had spent his entire career working within the system, trying to improve humanity's position through diplomacy and patience. Today, he knew that approach had failed. My friends, he began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. We have gathered to discuss the situation on New Busan, but I think we all know that this is not really about one colony. This is about everything. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Some were angry. Some were scared. All were tired. For 300 years, we have given the Council our blood. We have given them our labor. We have given them our children, sent off to die in wars that protect species who despise us. And what have we received in return? Scraps, insults, the constant reminder that we are tolerated, not accepted. The hall was silent. Every word he spoke was true, and everyone knew it. We have told ourselves that patience is a virtue, Bae continued. We have told ourselves that if we just work harder, sacrifice more, prove our worth one more time, eventually things will change. But they will not change. The Council does not see us as partners to be earned. They see us as resources to be used. He gripped the podium, his old hands steady despite his age. New Busan is not the first colony they have taken from us, and if we do nothing, it will not be the last. The question before us today is simple. How much more will we give before we have nothing left? How many more children will we bury in foreign soil before we decide that enough is enough? He stopped speaking and looked at the assembly. The silence stretched on for several long moments. Then someone in the back began to clap. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, applauding not for the speech, but for the decision it represented. When the vote was called, it was unanimous. For the first time in 300 years, humanity said no. The message went out to every human ship, every human colony, every human worker scattered across the galaxy. The words were simple and clear. We will not give them New Busan. We will not give them anything more. The time for patience is over. Governor Choi Yoon-ji received the message as she stood on her balcony. Looking out at the city her grandmother had helped build, for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. The Galactic Council had expected complaints. They had expected angry messages and diplomatic protests and perhaps some minor demonstrations that could be ignored or suppressed. What they did not expect was for the human fleets to move. The Palaxian Empire had positioned a small fleet in orbit around New Busan, ready to begin the evacuation process. They were not worried. Humans had never resisted a council decision before. There was no reason to think this time would be different. Then the sensors detected the incoming. Ships, Admiral Park's armada, did not emerge from hyperspace at New Busan. Instead, His fleet appeared directly above Palax Prime, the jeweled throne world of the Empire that had ordered the evacuation. Behind him came every human warship in the galaxy, hundreds of vessels that had been quietly recalled from the borders. They had guarded for centuries. The Palaxians had never seen so many human ships in one place. They had never imagined that humans would bring such force to bear against a council species. For the first time in living memory, fear crept into Palaxian hearts. Admiral Park opened communications on all frequencies. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of a man who had made peace with whatever would come next. "This is Admiral Park Doyen of the United Terran Navy," he announced. "The people of New Busan will not be moved. Any attempt to enforce the reclamation order will be considered an act of war against humanity. We await your decision." On Council Station, the reaction was immediate chaos. Representatives shouted at each other in a dozen different languages. The Tellurian Archon demanded that the Council fleet respond with overwhelming force. The Palaxian delegation insisted that this was an act of rebellion that must be crushed immediately. But there was a problem. A problem that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. The Council fleet was weak. For centuries, they had relied on human ships and human soldiers to handle any real military threats. The Council's own forces were mostly ceremonial, good for parades and displays of power, but useless in actual combat. If they attacked the human fleet, they would lose. Everyone in that chamber knew it. Dr. Kong Jisu sat in her corner, watching the panic unfold. She had spent years in this room, suffering through insults and dismissals, keeping her anger locked away where no one could see it. But today was different. Today, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Power. She rose from her seat. The movement was small, but in the chaos of the moment, it caught attention. Representatives turned to look at her, surprised that the human would dare to stand without being invited. Jisoo walked toward the center of the chamber. Her steps were slow and deliberate, and she held her head high. She was not asking for permission anymore. "For 300 years," she began, her voice cutting through the noise, "you have called us primitives. You have looked at us and seen only useful animals, creatures from a death world who were good for labor and war and nothing else." The chamber fell silent. No human had ever spoken this way in the council hall. "You have used our bodies to shield your worlds," Jisoo continued. "You have used our hands to build your prosperity. You have taken our colonies, our resources, our dignity, and through it all, we endured. We endured because we believed that patience and service would earn us a place among you." She reached the center of the chamber and stopped, standing where no human had ever been allowed to stand. "We were wrong." Her words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. "You will never see us as equals. It does not matter how much we sacrifice or how hard we work. In your eyes, we will always be the primitives from the death world, useful but never respected. So we will stop asking for your respect." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of species that had treated her kind as servants for 3 centuries. "From this moment forward, we will simply take it." The Palaxian High Lord rose from his seat, his scales flushing dark with anger. "This is madness," he hissed. "You cannot threaten the council. You do not have the strength. We will crush your little rebellion and remind you of your place." Jisoo smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "And try," she said. "Send your fleets against ours. See what happens when you fight your own battles instead of sending us to die for you. We have spent 300 years learning war while you forgot how to wage it. We have shed oceans of blood while you grew soft and comfortable. Do you really want to discover what we are capable of when we stop holding back?" The High Lord opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth of her statement was undeniable. Every victory the Council had won in living memory had been won by human soldiers. Every threat had been faced by human ships. The elder species had grown dependent on their servants, and now those servants were no longer willing to serve. Back on the Indomitable, Captain Yoon Hana monitored the communications from Council Station. She could hear the panic in their voices, the confusion and fear of creatures who had never imagined this moment would come. "They are scared," she said to Admiral Park. The Admiral nodded slowly. "They should be. Not because we will destroy them, but because for the first time they have to face the truth. They need us far more than we need them. On New Busan, Governor Choi Yoon-ji received word of what had happened. She gathered her people in the central plaza of the capital city. The same plaza where her grandmother had planted the first tree 200 years ago. "The fleet has come," she told them. "Admiral Park stands between us and those who would take our home. We are not alone anymore." The crowd erupted in cheers. For the first time in 90 days, the people of New Busan were not afraid. On Earth. Prime Minister Bae watched the events unfold with a mixture of pride and worry. They had taken the first step, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no going back now. He looked out the window of his office at the night sky. Filled with stars that humanity had bled to defend, "Whatever comes next," he said quietly to himself, "we face it standing tall." The reckoning had begun. The Palaxian Empire made the mistake of thinking humanity was bluffing. They had spent 3 centuries watching humans obey orders, accept insults, and quietly endure whatever treatment was given to them. They could not believe that such a compliant species would actually fight back. So, they sent a task force to New Busan, 30 warships. Commanded by Admiral Veth, a decorated officer who had won his medals in battles, fought entirely by human soldiers. He had never commanded a fleet in actual combat, but he was confident in his superiority. Humans were just animals, after all. How hard could it be to put them back in their place? Captain Yoon Hannah was waiting for him. Admiral Park had given her command of the defensive fleet. Knowing that she had more combat experience than any other officer in the Terran Navy, she had fought pirates, raiders, and the Vreth swarm. She had survived situations that should have killed her a dozen times over. And she had spent her entire career studying how the Council species thought and fought. She knew exactly what Admiral Veth would do before he did it. Palaxian fleet emerged from hyperspace in a tight formation. Expecting to intimidate the humans with a show of force, Veth broadcast a demand for immediate surrender, warning that any resistance would be met with total destruction. Hannah's response was a single torpedo, launched directly at his flagship. The Palaxians had never developed effective point defense systems because they had never needed to. Humans had always protected them. The torpedo struck the flagship's engine section and crippled the ship in the first seconds of the battle. What followed was not a fight. It was a lesson. Hannah's ships moved through the Palaxian formation like wolves through a flock of sheep. Human gunners had spent generations learning to hit targets that actually shot back. Human engineers had built ships designed for real combat, not ceremonial displays. Human captains had developed tactics through trial and blood and sacrifice. The Palaxians had none of these things. They had forgotten how to make war, and now they were paying the price. 4 hours later, 23 Palaxian ships drifted as burning wreckage. The remaining 7, including the crippled flagship, fled into hyperspace without looking back. Human casualties were 2 frigates damaged and no lives lost. Captain Hannah stood on her bridge, watching the surviving enemy ships run. She felt no joy in the victory, only a grim satisfaction. This was what happened when those who had grown soft tried to fight those who had been hardened by centuries of struggle. News. The battle spread across the galaxy like fire. The mighty Palaxian Empire, one of the founding members of the Galactic Council, had been defeated by the species they considered barely sentient. The impossible had happened. Suddenly everything seemed possible. On the agricultural world of Tessera, human farm workers heard about the victory and made a decision. For generations, they had worked the fields that fed 3 council species. They had labored in harsh conditions for minimal pay, growing food that they themselves were rarely allowed to eat. Now they shut down the processing plants and walked away. The effect was immediate. Tessera produced 40% of the food consumed by the Tellurian hegemony. Within days, store shelves began to empty. Within weeks, Tellurians were facing their first food shortage in 1,000 years. On the shipyards of Korriban Station, human engineers joined the movement. These were the people who built and maintained the vessels that kept the galaxy running. Everything from cargo freighters to passenger liners to the ceremonial warships of the Council fleet, they put down their tools and refused to pick them up again. Half-finished ships hung in their construction cradles, never to be completed. Vessels scheduled for maintenance went without repairs. The infrastructure that the Council had always taken for granted began to crumble. Sergeant, First Class M. Taiwan led the uprising on Acheron, a fortress world that guarded one of the most important hyperspace lanes in Council territory. He was a quiet man, 50 years old, with a face carved by decades of war. He had fought 12 campaigns for the Council, bled on a dozen different worlds, and buried more friends than he could count. Not once had any Council species bothered to learn his name. The human garrison on Acheron numbered 10,000 soldiers, all veterans of the endless wars that protected Council interests. When the Tellurian governor demanded that they resume their patrols, Taiwan gathered his troops in the main courtyard and addressed them. "For 30 years I have followed orders," he said. "I have gone where they sent me and killed who they told me to kill. I have done this because I believed I was protecting something worth protecting. But I was wrong. The Council does not see us as protectors. They see us as attack dogs, useful animals to be pointed at their enemies and forgotten afterward." He looked at the faces of his soldiers, men and women who had given everything for species that despised them. "Our duty was always to humanity," he continued. "We just forgot for a while. Today, we remember." Not a single soldier disagreed. When the Tellurian governor sent his personal guard to arrest Taiwan, they found 10,000 human soldiers standing between them and their target. The guard retreated without firing a shot. The Council convened emergency sessions every day. But every solution they proposed required resources or forces that humans controlled. They tried to hire mercenaries from the Outer Rim, but most mercenary companies were led by humans. They tried to restart their own military training programs. But they discovered that 3 centuries of neglect could not be undone in a few weeks. Prime Minister Bei Sunwoo addressed the galaxy from Earth. He stood on the steps of the Assembly Hall in Geneva, with the flags of every human world flying behind him. "We do not seek war," he declared. His voice broadcast to every corner of known space. "We do not seek vengeance for 3 centuries of mistreatment. We do not want to rule the galaxy or destroy those who have wronged us. We seek only what every sentient being deserves: the right to live free, the right to build our futures on our own terms, the right to be treated as equals in a galaxy we have bled to protect." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Grant us these things, and we will be the greatest allies you have ever known. We will defend the galaxy as we always have, not as servants, but as partners. We will share our strength and our knowledge and our determination with all who treat us with respect." His voice hardened. "Deny us, and learn what humanity becomes when it has nothing left to lose. We have spent 300 years learning to survive in a galaxy that tried to grind us down. We have grown strong in ways you cannot imagine. The choice is yours, but choose wisely. We will not ask twice." Across the galaxy, humans watched and waited. They had thrown off the chains that had bound them for so long. Now they would see if the galaxy was ready to accept them as equals, or they would have to take equality by force. The war that followed was short but brutal, not because humanity sought destruction, but because the Council had never prepared to fight without human soldiers on their side. The Tellurian hegemony attempted to assemble a fleet from their reserves. It was destroyed in a single engagement. The Palaxian Empire tried to blockade human colonies with their remaining ships. Captain Yoon Hannah broke the blockade in 3 days. One by one, the elder species discovered that military strength, built on ceremony and tradition, was no match for military strength forged in actual battle. But even as human fleets won victory after victory, Prime Minister Bei refused to push for total conquest. He remembered why they had started this fight in the first place. Not for revenge, not for power, for recognition, for dignity, for the right to stand as equals. Then the Vreth swarm returned. Sensors detected the first wave emerging from dark space. Millions of the insect creatures pouring toward Council territory. This was the largest swarm ever recorded, a force that could consume entire worlds if left unchecked. The Council species looked to their depleted fleets and knew they could not survive alone. An emergency message was sent to Admiral Park Do-yeon. It was not a demand this time. It was a plea. Park read the message alone in his quarters. For a long moment, he considered ignoring it. The Council had let 3 million humans die at Kepler Station. They had tried to steal New Busan. They had treated his people as disposable tools for 3 centuries. Part of him wanted to let them face the consequences of their arrogance. But he thought about his grandmother, who had taught him that strength without mercy was just another form of cruelty. He thought about the innocent civilians on Council worlds, beings who had never harmed anyone and did not deserve to be devoured by the swarm. He thought about the kind of humanity he wanted to help build. He called Dr. Kong Jisoo and asked her to deliver a message to the Council. Jisoo stood once again in the great chamber, but this time her seat was not in the back corner. This time, she stood at the center, where the elder species had always stood when addressing the assembly. "The Vreth swarm threatens all of us," she said. "Human and Tellurian, Palaxian and Terran. We can fight each other while the swarm destroys everything, or we can face this threat together." She looked around at the faces that watched her. Some showed fear. Some showed suspicion. Some showed something that might have been hope. Humanity is willing to defend the galaxy as we have always done, but not as servants, not as tools, as partners and equals. Recognize our sovereignty over all our existing colonies. Acknowledge our right to full council membership and a permanent seat on the Security Directorate. Agree to fair reparations for 3 centuries of exploitation. Do these things and we will stand beside you against the darkness. The Archon of the Tellurian hegemony rose to speak. His voice was quieter than it had been in previous sessions, stripped of the arrogance that had always marked his words. "And if we refuse?" he asked. Jisoo smiled, but there was no cruelty in it. Only a calm certainty that came from knowing exactly where she stood. "Then we will defend ourselves and our colonies," she replied. "You will have to defend yourselves. We both know how that would end." The vote took less than an hour. Centuries of pride and prejudice fell away in the face of simple survival. The Treaty of New Busan was drafted that very day. The signing ceremony took place on the colony that the BRD Council had tried to steal. Governor Choi Yoonji hosted the delegation, welcoming them to the world her grandmother had helped build from nothing. Admiral Park and Captain Yoon stood with her, along with Prime Minister Bae and Sergeant Im and all the others who had helped humanity find its voice. When Dr. Kong Jisoo signed the treaty on behalf of humanity, she used a pen that had belonged to her great-grandfather, a man who had died in the mines of a Palaxian colony without ever seeing Earth. She thought about him as she wrote her name, and she hoped that somehow, wherever he was, he knew that his sacrifice had not been forgotten. The war against the Vreth swarm lasted 18 months. Human fleets led the charge, but this time they were not alone. Council ships fought beside them, learning tactics and strategies that humans had developed over centuries of struggle. The swarm was pushed back, then broken, and finally destroyed in a final battle at the edge of known space. When it was over, the galaxy had changed. Humans sat on the council as equals, their voices heard in every debate. Human colonies were recognized as sovereign territory, protected by treaties that could not be ignored. Human children grew up knowing that they had a place among the stars, but the greatest change was not written in any treaty. It was in the way the elder species looked at humans now. Not as servants or animals or useful tools, but as partners, as allies. As People Captain Yoon Hannah, now Admiral Yoon, returned to New Busan 5 years after the treaty was signed. She had been promoted 3 times and offered commands that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. But today, she was not here on official business. She was here to see her daughter. Yoon Murray was 4 years old. Born in the first year of what people were calling the New Dawn, she had never known the old way, the time when humans bowed and scraped and accepted whatever treatment was given to them. To her, equality was simply how things were. Hannah sat with her daughter in the garden behind their home, watching the sun set over the city that her people had built from nothing. "Tell me a story," Mama Murray said, as she did every evening. Hannah smiled and pulled her daughter close. "I will tell you about your grandmother," she said. "She grew up on a mining colony, and she worked very hard so that one day you could have a better life." Why did she have to work so hard? It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of centuries. Hannah thought carefully about how to answer. "Because things were different then," she finally said. "There were people who thought they were better than us, and we had to prove them wrong. But we did not fight because we wanted to rule the galaxy. We fought because we wanted to be part of it. The difference matters." Myray nodded solemnly, not fully understanding but accepting her mother's words with the trust of a child. On Earth, in the great memorial plaza that honored the 3 million who had died at Kepler Station, new words had been carved beneath the original inscription. Visitors from 100 worlds came to read them. Species that had once considered humans barely sentient. Now standing in respectful silence before the monument, the old inscription read, "They held the line so that others might live," the new word said. "They held the line so that one day we could stand tall." We finally stood. Admiral Park Do-Jeon visited the memorial on the anniversary of the battle. He was old now, his hair white and his steps slower than they had been. But his eyes were clear. His heart was at peace. He had lived to see the day when human sacrifice was honored instead of forgotten. He had watched his people rise from servitude to partnership. He had helped build a galaxy where his grandchildren could dream without limits. As he stood before the memorial, young Tellurian approached him. The creature was barely an adult, born after the treaty, too young to remember the old ways. "Admiral Park," the Tellurian asked, "I wanted to thank you. My grandfather died at Kepler Station. The human soldiers tried to save him. I know the history now, and I know what your people went through. I just wanted you to know that we remember. We will always remember." Park looked at the young alien, at the sincerity in its silver eyes, and felt something release in his chest. A weight he had carried for decades finally lifted. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That is all we ever wanted, to be remembered." The Tellurian nodded and walked away, leaving Park alone with his thoughts and the memorial and the stars. Above, humanity had finally found its place among those stars, not through conquest or cruelty, but through strength and sacrifice and the simple refusal to accept anything less than dignity. The quiet burden was over. A new dawn had begun.